A reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 35, verses 4 through 10 and 20 through 29. And then chapter 40, verses 34 through 38. Moses said to the whole Israelite community, "This is what the Lord has commanded. From what you have, take an offering for the God. Everyone who is willing to bring to the Lord an offering of gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and another type of durable leather, acacia wood, olive oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and breastpiece. All who are skilled among you are to come and make everything the Lord has commanded." Then the whole Israelite community withdrew from Moses' presence, and everyone who was willing and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to the Lord for the work on the tent of meeting, for all its service, and for all the sacred garments. All who were willing, men and women alike, came and brought gold jewelry of all kinds, brooches, earrings, rings, and ornaments. They all presented their gold as a wave offering to the Lord. Everyone who had blue, purple, scarlet yarn, or fine linen, or goat hair, ram skins dyed red, or the other durable leather brought them. Those presenting an offering of silver or bronze brought it as an offering to the Lord, and everyone who had acacia wood for any part of the work brought it. Every skilled woman spun with their hands and brought what she had spun, blue, purple, scarlet yarn, or fine linen. And all the women who were willing and had skill spun the gold hair. The leaders brought onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and breastpiece. They also brought spices and olive oil for the light and for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense. All the Israelite men and women who were willing brought to the Lord free will offerings for all the work the Lord through Moses had commanded them to do. Exodus 40. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all travels of the Israelites, wherever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out, until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. The word of the Lord.
Thanks, Hannah. All right, so this is our final sermon in our entire sermon series on the book of Exodus that we started all the way back in September, if you can even remember that far. And through it, we've been sort of tracking with the journey of the Israelites through the wilderness as God saved them from the hand of Pharaoh and is now forming them to be his people, forming a people for himself. And that's really been the goal of the entire Exodus. That's been the whole point of the Exodus narrative and why they're in the wilderness. God is reforming them to really free them, not just from physical slavery, but emotional, spiritual slavery over the wrong masters to finally live the life that they're called to live in relationship with him. Now, last week, we actually talked about how the typical journey of someone in Christianity kind of goes like this. You start coming to God because you want something from him. And then over time, you want to start doing things for him. But then finally, as you grow and mature, you start to realize that the relationship is the whole point. And so you just want to be with him. And that's what we saw last week, right? When we saw the Israelites actually see the importance of God's presence and his glory being with them. They said, we're not going to go into the promised land unless you go with us because you're more important than anything that you can give to us. And so starting last week, we started to see glimpses of Israel's real heart change and radical transformation from being former slaves to actually learning what it's like to be a worshiper of God, to really prioritize their relationship with him. And today, this final section of Exodus that we just read really comes to a climax of all of the book of Exodus. And this, in the building of the tabernacle, really becomes this ultimate test of Israel's true freedom. Because God asked them to give this costly free will offering for the purposes of God. And as former slaves, the question remains are you actually going to now give? Or are you going to return to your scarcity slave mindset, cling to the things that you have because you're too afraid to actually give of your whole self to what God is calling you to the greater purposes that God has in mind for Israel. And of course, we see in our passage that we actually do see the radical transformation of the Israelites, giving from a willing heart. And you start to see them become truly human, what God had always been out to give, to make them to be. And one of the marks that we learn of what it means to be truly human is, are you actually freed to give of yourself, to give yourself away versus hoard and to keep things just for yourself? And so that's sort of what God has been after this whole time. We see a mark of that. And I think for us, it helps us to learn, do we actually have a relationship with God that can free us for us to live the life that he wants us to live, to give of our whole selves, not for our own purposes, but for his. And if we want to become people like that, we're going to have to see the three things that the Israelites saw here in this passage. First, they saw the greater truth in life. And then they saw a greater vision for life. And then finally, they saw the greatest gift of life. That's what ultimately and finally frees them to give and to be part of God's purposes. So let's look at that. The greater truth, the greater vision, and the greater gift, the greatest gift in life. So first, one of the big narratives that we skipped in the Exodus passage is actually all about the instructions for and the building of the tabernacle. It takes up like 10 chapters in the 40 chapters of Exodus, and we kind of skipped around it. So even from Exodus 25 all the way to 31, it's all God giving Moses the instructions for how to build this tabernacle, and then from Exodus 35 until the end of it, Exodus 40, it's also the building of that tabernacle. That one little gap was the excursus that we took, where we saw the Israelites actually fall into idolatry with the golden calf. And so as we return back into the building of the tabernacle, it's sort of God saying, hey, you thought in your sin that you were going to derail my plans. Actually, we're right back to what I had always intended. We're going to continue to build this tabernacle. And we're going to talk a lot more on the next point about what the tabernacle actually is and the significance of it, and there's great significance. But the tabernacle was essentially just a portable temple. This was like sacred holy ground where God dwelled and met with his people, where relationship happened, where worship happened. And so this tabernacle was always meant to be the center of Israel's entire life. That's why so much of Exodus is devoted to the instructions and building of it. And so when God gives this instruction, he also calls them, what we read, for Israel to give from what they have. And everyone willing, out of a free will offering, now gives in order to build this tabernacle for the Lord. And what were the materials that were required in order to build it? We read it, right? It's like these extremely extravagant and like splendid, I don't know if that's a word, beautiful materials, right? Like gold, silver, gems, fine linen, ram's hair, leather, lots of different things that make up the building of the tabernacle, the things that are required for the building of the tabernacle. And in this moment, if you track with the Israelite story, the obvious question starts to come up. Well, where in the world did former slaves who had nothing to their name get these kinds of fine materials for the extravagant building of this tabernacle? How did these former slaves come to possess this? And to actually get to the greater truth of that, we need to go back to Exodus chapter 12. Here's what it says. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So when God says to give from what they have, what he is actually doing is reminding them of this greater truth they are meant to never forget and always instill in their lives, that everything that they had was always first and foremost a gift that the Lord provided for them. That is always the starting point, the greater truth that God had always provided for Israel everything that they had. And now that was what God was requiring back from them. Now, this is not only true of the Israelites, but when you read the Bible, this is a main narrative and a thread that's all throughout Scripture. We can't get away from it. This idea that God is the ultimate giver of every good gift that you and I have. Here's 1 Chronicles 29. King David says this, "Who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. And the Apostle Paul in the New Testament says to the church in Corinth, what do you have that is not a gift? You see, this is this fundamental truth, this greater truth, this true reality that not only Israel, but we are all meant to live out. That the starting point for Israel, as well as for us, is that God is always the ultimate provider of all of our gifts. Rather than us thinking that we are self-made, self-sustaining people and many gods who have just made our lives out on our own. And I think that is a narrative that is very hard for us to actually accept, especially living here in this country as well as living here in this city. Right? The American dream basically says there's so much opportunity out there that as long as you maximize your effort, as long as you work hard, then you can earn a great living. That's the immigrant story. And then New York City is like a steroid version of that idea. That if you come here to this city and you work hard and you maximize every opportunity given, then you can really earn and make something of yourself. See, that's the story that the city is always telling us about ourselves. And when you see it that way, and not that everything is a gift from God, what happens is that it starts to warp your view of yourself and your resources. And therefore, it starts to warp your relationship with other people as well as the purposes of God. See, the more that you feel like you earned it, that you are responsible for every good thing that you have, this is what will happen. It will be so easy for you to give to yourself, and it will become increasingly very, very difficult for you to give genuinely to any other person or any other purpose outside of yourself. And it makes a lot of sense. All you got to do is flow it back up to the understanding of, well, the basis of who gets the credit. If you fundamentally believe that you get the credit for your life and for what you have, then your entire outlook on life will be very different. Because who you give the credit to is most easily who your resources flow back to. Like, this isn't a difficult thing for us to understand. Like, if you really believe that you've earned it and it's all based off of you, what you will do is first and foremost make sure that you are taken care of, that your resources are spent mostly on you so that you are entitled to get what you think you deserve because you earned it. And if anybody says you've got to use your money, your resources, or your life in any other way, you'll say, well, who are you to tell me that? But if you actually realize this greater truth, that so much of your life has been out of your control, so much has been ordained by God, like where you were born, what generation you were born in, where you live, the relationships that you have, the experiences that you've had, the people that you've met. So many things are actually out of your control and foreordained by God. Which means, ultimately, God is meant to get the credit for your life, which breeds not an entitlement for what you and I deserve, but it will fundamentally instead breed gratitude for what he has given to you. And that leads to a completely different relationship to yourself and your resources as well as to other people. Because now, if that is true, if that's the greater truth that you believe, then now that means God, who gets the credit, most deserves to say what you should do with those things. He now has the greatest say over your life and your resources, and it becomes a joy to return it back to him. See, that's the difference. And if you want an earthly example of this, just think about, I come from an immigrant background. My parents were, I came here when I was 3 years old. My parents came from South Korea. And the immigrant story is essentially this. Like, why is it that second-generation immigrant kids so easily give back to their parents? Because they know that they aren't here on their own, that others have sacrificed and provided for them. And so one of the easiest things for immigrant kids to do is just give to their parents, because this is foundational understanding that there is this recognition that it was not possible without their sacrifice and their work. Or, these stories of like professional athletes who had a really hard upbringing, right? Single mom, like Kevin Durant gave this famous MVP. Kevin Durant's a basketball player. He gave this famous MVP speech, and he's just in tears up there during his speech because he's just saying thank you to his mom the whole time. If it wasn't for her, he wouldn't be up here. And then he famously says, "You're the real MVP," and everyone starts crying, right? See, who you give credit to is where your resources most easily and naturally flow right back up to. And the biblical idea is saying your parents, the other people that you give credit to, that is just a mere shadow of the ultimate truth. That you got to keep going up, that at the end of the day, it's really God who has ultimately given you and provided you all of these things. And that is what Israel must not forget. That whatever God has asked of them to give, it's always, first and foremost, something that he has provided to them. This is the first thing that we've got to see if you want to break out of a slavery mentality and to start living a life of freedom that God has called you into. And if you actually see God and like what he's asking of you, if you see him as like wanting to take things away from you or wanting to profit from you, you just don't fundamentally understand this point. That it's all his, and in his grace, he has given it to you. And this is the thing that God is rewiring in the hearts of the Israelites that they finally come to understand. They see this first greater truth. But then secondly, God also calls them into a greater vision for life. He gives the Israelites, and he gives to us, real purpose and meaning for this life that will require all of us, like the wholeness of us to give to it. See, when God is actually inviting the Israelites to contribute to and to build the tabernacle, what he is ultimately saying is, I want you to be a part of my story for the entire world. I'm not just building this thing. This is me inviting you graciously to be a part of my story for the entire world. Now, the tabernacle, like I mentioned, is this sacred, holy space where God comes to meet with his people. Right? Temples and shrines, sort of in all cultures, kind of get to that idea, a connection between the transcendent heaven, right, to earth today, the meeting place with God. But here's the thing that the Bible teaches, that this tabernacle was never really meant to be it was never really meant to exist. You realize that? Like when you go back and read from the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 1 and 2, we see Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And in the Garden of Eden, there was no tabernacle. There was no temple. Why is that? Because the entire place was holy ground. The entire garden, the entire world was sacred. It was fit for Adam and Eve to dwell directly in the presence of this holy God, where they walked freely in the presence of one another. Can you imagine that? That is what the Garden of Eden represented, because there was this complete harmony, right relationship with God, right relationship with one another, and right relationship with the rest of the world. That is the biblical word of peace, or shalom. There was perfect harmony. And that is why God just dwelled in that space. There wasn't a need for a temple. But with the beginning of Genesis chapter 3 and the fall of mankind, creation now, we read, is fallen. It's broken. Things are not the way that it should be because of sin, because of Adam and Eve and humanity saying, I want to do things my own way. And that fundamentally breaks relationship with God. It throws everything out of whack. So therefore now the world is no longer the way that it is supposed to be. And so Adam and Eve gets exiled from Eden because the world is not fit. The world is not in a right relationship with God. And that, of course, is the definition of what the Bible says is fundamentally what is wrong with this entire world. That whatever problems you see out there that you think is the greatest problem, from a biblical Christian standpoint, it comes back to this idea, that it goes back to a self-love that humanity has rather than a God-focused love. That's the reason why everything gets thrown out of whack. And therefore, the tabernacle then had to become necessary out of God's grace in order to remain in relationship with his people, the one place where a holy God could actually be in a relationship and in the presence with a sinful, fallen, broken people, where they could still relate with one another. See, that's why the tabernacle was this piece of holy ground in a world that has lost its way. And therefore, the tabernacle represented a microcosm of the world as it was meant to be. It was a piece of heaven on earth where God not only dwelled with his people, but also showed the world and his people that he is at work to bring about the redemption of the whole world. And that's why there is so much significance and meaning in the building of the tabernacle. If you have time, go back and read it, but we skipped through a lot of the instructions, but I would highly recommend you to read it. And when you read it, a couple of things jump out, and here's what that means. Right, there is the beauty and the diversity of the materials that are used in the building of the tabernacle. Why is that? Well, because God was the creator of the whole world. All of those things came from him. And so he was affirming the goodness and the beauty of creation. And that's what the temple is made with. And when you continue to read, there's all these like perfect dimensions, exact dimensions, as well as precise instructions for exactly how every rod and how every space is meant to be placed and how it's meant to be placed. Well, why is that? Because it was God showing that he's always, as the creator, brought order, wonderful order, out of chaos. That's what he does in the beginning of all of creation. But then most importantly, the tabernacle was looking back at God's original plan to dwell with humanity in the temple of his creation, while also looking forward to the renewal of the whole world, where he would one day make everything right again, so that he might again dwell in the temple of his creation with the whole world renewed. That the promise of Scripture is that he is going to make everything right again and make you and I a place that's fit for us to dwell and be in God's full presence again. Like, there is so much happening in the tabernacle. And it's not just the materials, right? But we also read in our passage that there are all these gifts and the skills of the whole community that is required in order to build the actual tabernacle. Like skills of spinning hair, and later on you actually read about lots of artists that are commissioned to come and work on the tabernacle. The full participation of the entire community is required to build it. Now, let's just pause for a moment and just think about how wild that is. Think about God is going through painstaking detail and instructions to tell his people to make this thing that is so, so critical and important, that communicates so much. And yet, instead of him making it himself to ensure that perfection, he asks the Israelites, who, by the way, are a bunch of screw-ups, right? People who have turned their back on him all the time. And yet he entrusts them, he invites them, and requires them to be a part of the building process of the tabernacle. That is an incredible idea, where it could have been so much easier for him to do it himself, and yet he invites his people to do it. You know when like little kids want to help you do something, right? You're smiling because it's like, okay, great, you can help me make dinner, or yeah, you can help do some of these chores, and it always takes longer. It's never done perfectly well, right? But you let them do it because it's a relationship. Now, would you let a kid make your work presentation? No. Something that's so critical or important? No. You say, get out of the room. I don't want you to mess anything up. And yet, God invites his broken people to participate in making it. And what is it that we learn from that? It is that God, the way that God plans to bring about his renewal, his healing for the world that the tabernacle points to, his vision for it was always to do that through his people, not in spite of his people. That God is not going to magically make the world a better place all of a sudden, but instead he graciously invites us for his vision for the entire world. And now that is an incredible idea that I want to impress deeper upon us, that every single one of us here in this room have been uniquely gifted and equipped by God, all the things that he's given to you. Your life circumstances, your relationships, your job, your resources, everything that makes up you has been given to you by God, not so you can maximize your own life and live the best kind of life for you. But he has given it to you so that you might give of it, to be a part of his renewing, redemptive purposes for a broken and hurting world that is desperate for the hope of a tabernacle to grow. Have you ever thought about that? That you are not called to just build your own little kingdoms here with the things that God has given to you, but that we are all meant to participate in what he is doing, to give of ourselves radically and sacrificially, to see the healing and the hope and the peace and the freedom of the whole world. And that is a greater purpose and a greater vision that he is actually inviting us constantly into. To be a part of seeing more of heaven on earth here in Brooklyn. And of course, as God is making his people to be truly human, he's also saying that without this, you're not truly human. That we're all made to live for something much greater than ourselves. I know you feel it deep down inside, because the moment you go to work and you just feel like you want to die because you don't feel like you're doing anything meaningful, that shows and points to our need for us to be a part of something so much greater and so much bigger than ourselves, to get a sense of fulfillment and great purpose. And that's the very thing that God gives to us, gives to Israel, by inviting their participation into this temple. How you will most flourish in life, is to start to see this to be true. And for you to start giving of yourself, not only your resources, but all of yourself away. That a relationship with God is not just about Sunday and coming to church or doing a couple of things. That it is not just about a private spiritual life that we have apart from him, that God only cares about this particular spiritual sphere. No. Your life will start to flourish as you start to see God calling you every day into every sphere to give of your whole self for what he is doing and not for what you want to do. To bring him glory, not to build up your own glory. Because that's the only way you will start to point people toward this renewing work. And it only happens if we give of our whole selves to his story and not ours. There's a great vision that he's actually inviting us to and the Israelites to. But then finally, let's look at this. The Israelites saw this greater truth. They got this great vision. But those two things alone are still not enough to free them completely, fully, to be fully human, to be truly human, to live the life that he had called them to. See, these first 2 points, these first 2 ideas can absolutely get every single one of us to give more of ourselves, sure. To start to say, yeah, what am I doing with my resources? What am I doing with my time? Yeah, you know what? I really should invite God into more of this. Out of guilt, out of obligation, or a sense of got to be here, pay your taxes to God. We can absolutely do that with those 2 things. But the key thing that's happening in our verse that really changes their heart is this. We read it, but it really screams throughout the entire passage, even in the places that we skipped. Is that God asks them for what kind of offering? A free will offering. Anyone who is willing of heart to give. Now, that idea of a free will offering, when you look at the Hebrew word, it's all about a heart compulsion. That is what actually causes them to give. And this shows that Israel finally gets it. They finally have that heart change that God was looking for, moving from slaves as a scarcity mindset to now fully and freely giving of themselves. Why? Because it had to be that they finally understood that at the end of the day, they were getting something much better than what they were ever possibly giving. That what they were actually getting in the tabernacle was God himself, his presence, his glory. And this is what we talked about last week. That all of the gold and the gems and whatever resources that they had could never fill the hole in their hearts of what God is meant to give them. The security, the hope, the peace, the love, the hope of a renewed world. And this is the moment, therefore, that they finally come to become no longer slaves, but worshipers seeing God as the ultimate prize, his presence, his glory, the most important thing. And that is why we read in Exodus 40, the very last passage of the entire book of Exodus. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because a cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And then we read that this stayed with the Israelites during all of their travels. They got God. They got the thing that they really needed. But there's still a problem. I don't know if you picked up on it, but you see, when God's presence comes into the tabernacle now that he's with them, Moses can't go in. Why is that? The glory, the relationship is there, but Moses can't go in. And then the next book right from here is the book of Leviticus that will lay out the entire dilemma of the tabernacle. That this holy, sacred space where God dwells is still very much off limits to just any human being. That just because there is this sacred space, it does not mean that we are now worthy and ready to just be in his presence. And so even Moses can't go in. And the entire book of Leviticus is going to point out how and why they need to start giving sacrifices, spilling blood in order to enter into the presence of God. Because what was lost in Eden, there was a great, great price to pay in order to regain all of that back. And so even the entire construction of the temple was made in order to make that whole point. That the closer and closer you got to the center, it was closer to what was called the holiest of holies. Where only in that place where the full presence of God's presence dwelt. That the high priest only once a year could enter into that place on the Day of Atonement to sacrifice and pay for the sins of all of his people, to ensure that God would still be with them and God would not reject them, to show the gravity of what was lost. And so the tabernacle, even though it's built, yes, it shows that God is with them, but it's still limited. There is still a barrier. And therefore, the whole world can't experience all of the hope of the renewal without that sin, that barrier ultimately and finally being dealt with. And friends, that is where we get the hope of what Jesus Christ alone comes to bring. Do you know what the crazy thing that the writer of the Gospel of John, what he says in John chapter 1, he says, the Word became flesh and he dwelt among us. You know what the real Greek word is there? The Word became flesh and Jesus, he tabernacled among his people. Jesus now is the fullness of God's presence. Jesus comes to be the tabernacle himself, this temporary place where we got to actually meet God, not without a barrier. Jesus comes and says, now I am the way that you meet God. I am the way that you have a relationship with him. It's only through me that this barrier of this sacred space, this relationship can now be kept. Because Jesus goes into the place where Moses and no other person is ever allowed in, to the holiest of holies, to make atonement once and for all by giving his life fully and completely. So that you and I, as we look to him for our sins, for our unworthiness, can find life and relationship in him. And so Jesus now says, come to me, and I will give you a relationship with the Father. I am the temple now. The temple no longer needs to exist because I have fully fulfilled it. And on the cross, that's why Jesus cries out, it is finished. And we read that the veil was torn, that barrier that we've always had before God. Jesus fully and finally deals with it because he alone can deal with what is truly wrong with the world. Sin, our broken relationship with him. And once that happens, you know what happens? The Spirit of God breaks out to give hope to this world of real renewal, real hope in the midst of darkness. But it doesn't break out to the entire world for the renewal of everything. You know where it breaks out to first? It breaks out into you and me. The writer of the New Testament, Paul, he says this in 1 Corinthians. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? What he is saying is that now the church, you and I, we are the temple. We are the place where God dwells. And we therefore become his plan of renewal and hope in this world. That he would use beautifully broken people, just like the Israelites, for his great and immense purposes to bring healing and freedom in Jesus. That now the hope of the world rests on what the church does through what Jesus has come to do. Because Jesus hasn't come just to magically make everything new again apart from us, but he's come to change us so that we might now be on mission with him, not to live for ourselves, but to give ourselves away and be a part of his work in this world. And as we look to him, the one who gave everything and held nothing back to be our greatest gift, now calls us to be a gift to where we live, to Brooklyn, here as a church, that others might see this tabernacle and give God honor and glory and have hope, immense, immense hope in the midst of a broken world. May it be so. Let me pray.